Hello, and welcome to another episode of Your Therapist Needs Therapy, the podcast where mental health professionals talk about their own mental wellness journeys and how they navigate staying mentally well while working in the mental health field. Today, I am joined by Hannah Brents. Hannah, thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, I'm super excited to be here.
You are the theology therapist on Instagram, which I think is how I initially crossed paths, all us religious trauma folks on Instagram.
Yeah.
And we'll talk about that and get into that. But I want to start with my normal question, which is always, how did you get into the mental health field? What kind of brought you here?
Yeah. So I had initially rejected any recommendation or push in the direction of psychology, but I went to get my master's degree in divinity. And during that time, I was on a travel seminar in Israel, Palestine, and realized there were some other dual degree students there for between religion and social work. And I just realized I'm going to need a job soon. And this feels like a really, like the exact perfect blend of my head meets heart.
Sure.
And so it was really the concrete implementation of a lot of the philosophical, ethical work that I'd been doing up to that point.
Yeah. And was psychology like kind of that aha moment, sociology kind of that like, oh, this makes sense? Or was that something that you've been like interested in? Was that something that was shunned growing up? Like, I know for me, psychology was not something that was promoted, being
Mhm.
raised kind of in a high control religion.
Yeah, so it wasn't at least within my nuclear family, it wasn't shunned by any means, but it just wasn't like really talked about. We just didn't talk about it. But ironically, so I went to get my bachelor's degree in religion, and that was a no-no because I identify as a woman. And
Sure.
so the nudge was to like go into psychology, or teaching, which was like way more like cool or kosher than doing religion. Um,
Sure.
so so part of my like deconstruction and healing process was initially being like, you're all trying to get me to do this thing. Hell no. And then years later coming back around and realizing it was actually what I wanted to do.
Yeah. So you had a master's of divinity and got a master's in social work then too, or give us the
Yeah.
rest of the
So
history there.
yeah. So I got a master's in social work, and I was in the process of getting a master's in divinity, but I did not want to be in school that much longer. So
Sure.
I switched to get a master's in theological studies. So that's sort of a little bit of a technical thing. And the only thing that really changed is 1 year of school.
Yeah. Yeah. So then what was your introduction into the field kind of like? Like,
Yeah.
where'd you start out working, and give us some of that history if you don't
Yeah,
mind.
totally. So my introduction, I think, was quite different. Maybe not to some of the other people, like other therapists in the religious trauma field, but to the other people in my social work program, it was quite different. I was my introduction into the field was in inpatient state in forensic inpatient hospitalizations. And so you worked my really like main background was in persistent severe and persistent mental illness, and loved that. I realized like those were my people, but because of the managed care system with insurance and things like that, when I was working, I started to burn out quite quickly. And at that point, I had met my partner, and we were in an international long distance relationship. And so that burnout paired with international long distance, I decided I'm going to quit my job. And so I quit my job and I moved to Europe. And I did like clinical part-time work and then opened my private practice. And so it was a totally different, it was kind of left field almost, kind of right turn from the work that I'd been doing with like chronic and persistent mental illness. And it was a totally different, like I was working with totally different clients. And so it's been honestly a learning process.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What was like the timeline there for, because I'm always kind of curious how new professionals, whether social work or therapy, I think often have these high intensity jobs because it's
Yeah.
hard to get people who have been in the field for a long time to stay with those jobs. So I'm always
Yeah.
curious what like the burnout timeline is, because in my head I'm always like, oh, you got like 5 years to play with early in your career.
Oh my God, no. Burnout, because I think it would have been a little bit different if my context was a little bit different, but my burnout was like 1 year.
Sure. Because of those
So
other circumstances.
other circumstances, and I was working in a private hospital, which is a little bit different than a like sort of state or public hospital. And so it's just like the revolving door on the patients who we saw was so high, I guess you might say, that we were seeing the same people all the time. And so then it just starts to feel like, am I doing anything productive or helpful here? When I'm just seeing the same people over and over. And so it just started to feel like, okay, this system is broken, and that like there's so much work here that I can't get it all done. And then the sort of like other circumstantial context, I think,
Yeah.
also played into that.
What did you have any training around running a private practice? Did you have any business knowledge coming out of grad school?
None. Yeah, no, definitely not.
Which I have a lot of people who own their own practices. I'm a little biased as somebody who owns their own practice because I think it's a good thing for the field. But yeah, that's a common theme of
Yeah.
like kind of you have the mental health stuff, you have the social work stuff, the therapy stuff, but you don't have any preparation. Like it's just kind of like
Yeah.
you'll do agency work and figure it out. And like that's not sustainable for a lot of people.
No, and like honestly, I knew this. I was interning when I was in grad school with a woman who we were interns together, and I'm so grateful that I knew her at the time. But she told me that she was going to make 50,000 or whatever, I don't remember, whenever we graduated. And I was like, yeah, I'm going to do that too. And I lived in Boston at the time, which is one of the highest, has the highest cost of living in the country. And so I just knew like I could do that, and I needed that in order to afford like living in a studio in Boston, even like so many years ago now. And I had the worst job I've ever had right out of college. Worst, it was unsafe, and it felt unsafe for so many reasons. And my boss underpaid. I could only pay rent and not utilities, not food, nothing else, just rent. And my boss, I said, I'm like going to quit because I can't afford to live and work here. He said, well, how much do you think you're going to make anywhere else? And I said, I can make 50,000. And he said, no, you can't. You can't make that anywhere. And it just was like, I think that is the kind of culture that we are talking about with around like the helping profession, is even like your mentors, or at least mine, in the field, are so not hopeful about what it can be like.
Yeah, well, and I think you brought up insurance earlier. Like for me, I've been in the field for 15 years now. Like I think that I was presented with that's the only way to make money is you have to take insurance, and like it sucks, but it is what it is. At the time, like when I started doing therapy, the reimbursement rates were like $60 a session. And those have improved, but it's still lower than what a lot of people are going to charge in private practice, like just to be able to pay their bills. Like I think people are often surprised when people say I make X amount of dollars and I'm on food stamps still, or I still qualify for benefit, because it's so expensive, especially depending on where you live. Someplace like Boston or Colorado, Denver area right now is super expensive. Like there's so many things that go into this where you have a job that's high stress, and then you're like struggling to make ends meet. So it's a recipe for burnout. Like if I wanted to make someone burn out, this is how I would go about doing that.
Totally. And as a therapist, in my clinical practice, the most stressed that I ever see people is when they are financially stressed.
Yeah.
Like we go into the hair pulling phase and the, like the pressured speech and saying things that are like making decisions that they wouldn't probably normally.
Yeah. Yeah. And then you're practicing in a system, like you said, is broken. Like I practice
Yeah.
in Milwaukee, very few resources for people, not for people who are struggling to have money, like
Yeah.
6 to 9 months to find a psychiatrist. Like it's
Right.
just a nightmare scenario for trying to get people support when you're doing your best as a therapist to support them.
Yeah, totally. And it's just like such a catch-22. It's like I think therapists who are out of network have availability oftentimes and specialize. But there's like that upfront cost associated with it, whereas insurance-based therapists don't have availability. And like there's just this like kind of catch-22 here, I think, with
Yeah.
the kind of managed care system.
Yeah. And it's not helpful for people trying to get support, but like it's tough for therapists too, not to like throw a pity party for ourselves here, but like you have the ethical dilemma of like
Yeah.
not everyone can afford to see me, or the ethical dilemma of practicing in a way that doesn't fit for you because you have to
Yeah.
do what the insurance company is going to reimburse you for.
Right. Totally. Oh, worse.
Yeah. It's turned into a bummer of an episode so far.
I know. Anyways.
Yeah, segue out of that. No, but like, so obviously not having a ton of training in private practice, but then getting into private practice, like
Yeah.
what's that experience been? Like you said, it's some learning as you go.
Yeah.
Um, can you talk a little bit about that experience?
Yeah. Um, so I've just done so much training since getting into private practice, and I love it. I do. I mean, I love having my private practice,
Mhm.
and I just couldn't I couldn't imagine doing anything else. And um, so it's just always like there's just so much out there to learn, and it's so easy to get into like shiny object syndrome even with trainings, whether it's like business trainings on like how to be a business owner, or whether it's on like how to be a better clinician. And so I think it's this nice balance, or finding a balance between um, really developing both aspects of that kind of part of the job. And so some of the trainings that I've done before have been like really in trauma work. So I specialize in a lot of trauma work, and then I have the religious like background. I have the bachelor's and master's, and so that's really how where the religious trauma specialization came in from, was it was really the pairing of my formal and then experiential background.
Sure. Yeah. And so then building that as kind of your specialty in your private practice, I think obviously it's great having that trauma background, because when you're working with something like religious harm or high control religion, you see
Yeah.
so much trauma inherent in that. You know, we talk about religious trauma as a concept. Um, so yeah, do you want to talk a little bit about that as a specialty, kind of how you help people? We'll get into some of your marketing stuff, because I know you've got a group running and a wait list and all this great stuff that you're doing. But talk about like kind of building that as like your area of specialty from a business perspective of like, how did you start to build this and market this as like, hey, this is what I do. These are the people I work with.
Yeah. I think that I started making a ton of reels. And I started that like coming up now on a year ago. And it was it just was like so different, like using such a different part of my brain than with all the other work that I was doing. And it was just like kind of fun to think about ways in communicating, like how this shows up in my life and in other people's lives that I know, or who I talk to, or who reach out to me. And so And I think that like a lot of times, I think academia like ruined writing for me. I can only now write you a 25-page research paper. I can really struggle with like anything that's relatable or interesting. And so like video actually felt like an approachable way for me to kind of get into the space, and communicate with people outside of like just having a website, because I think that it just feels easier for me to connect with folks through video, even if it's not like one-on-one.
Sure. Yeah, that's interesting. I think I hated writing in APA format so much that having permission to do these super informal blog posts was like a breath of fresh air for me.
Right.
But it's weird, right? Even in the sense of like marketing, like my grad school was very against putting yourself as a person out there. Like it was this unprofessional thing. And then when you're a private practice owner, you're like, oh wait, like I have to learn how to market this, which is a totally different mindset.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And I think even like I've been doing a lot of learning about this recently. And I think even just like it challenges me to be like precise. I think that as someone who just is like inundated with this all the time, like this content of like religious harm and etc., it just is easy for me to make assumptions about what other people are thinking. And so the other day I had somebody who is like, I don't even know if they've ever been religious, but look at my account and say like, but like, what is religious trauma? Like, okay, wait a second, And so like, I think it just really helps with, at least me, with communicating in precision and not making assumptions about what other people know or don't know or where people are coming from.
Yeah. And I think it's great online that there's a community for deconstruction. Like as somebody who's leaving religion, my experience, like I didn't find all those podcasts that are super helpful and awesome until after I had deconstructed. Because right, that's the information control. When you're in a high control religion, you don't know what's out there. But so there are communities around deconstruction. There are communities around religious harm. There are communities for professionals like us who work with the religious trauma field. But like those can become their own kind of little echo chambers, and it's this balancing act, I think, of someone who's starting to question their faith is at a way different point than somebody who's 2 years outside of their like organized religion. So that process that happens is a lot of change, and so we as professionals, right, have to kind of be aware of like where are people at in their process.
Yeah, totally. And I think that has been it has been a really good challenge for me because my crisis of faith and my deconstruction really happened about 10-15 years ago. And so I feel oftentimes like really so far removed from what it felt like that like I keep meaning to like make something about this or put this out there, but like my partner lovingly says to me, or that like if I was still that way, we would not be together. Because like when I think about it, it was a completely different life, and I was a completely different person, and you're like it is its own echo chamber.
Yeah. And I think not in a culty way that like organized religion can be, but like, yeah, it's fascinating. I think I see this with a lot of the deconstruction podcasts, and like not to cast aspersions on anyone, but like they kind of filter themselves out after 2 or 3 years, because once you've been deconstructed for 2 or 3 years, it just, that process has less meaning to you. Like you're interested in other things.
Yeah.
So it's it's interesting. I think I've been out of organized religion for about 5 years and out and about as an atheist for about 2 years. But it is interesting. Like you have to catch yourself. I'll have new clients who come in and they're like, I don't think I have religious trauma. I'm like, oh, right. We gotta go.
Yeah.
Okay, let's
Welcome.
back up. So it's interesting. I think it saves so much time as therapists to understand something like purity culture. Like somebody can say those words and I instantly know what that means. Doesn't mean
Yeah,
I don't ask clarifying questions, doesn't mean we don't dig into it, but like
yeah.
there's a shorthand that's available, which I think is really
Mhm.
helpful for people, and that they don't have to necessarily re-traumatize every aspect of their
Yeah,
culty upbringings.
yeah.
But at the same time, like where you're at when you've deconstructed for 2 years, 5 years, 10 years is different than when you're going through the process.
Yeah, and what I would say is actually that has been a little bit hard for me to nuance online, is that that is actually the space that I prefer to be in. Um, and maybe just personality or interest, but I am less clinically speaking. I would say like a little bit less interested in that immediate crisis of faith,
Hmm.
and really more interested in the like sort of 2 to 10 year gap
Yeah.
there.
How do you
Um,
rebuild it?
exactly, because, and I think that that's really where my like academic religious background comes in, is that I, like, for example, I went to Boston University and was surrounded by people who were different than me. And I learned, like I had to learn how to think for myself, how to form opinions, and how to disagree respectfully, and how to like make friends with people who are different than me, and that all of this is okay. And I think that because in that 2 to 10 year gap, you start to return to some amount of equilibrium in life after that initial crisis. You start to return to status quo without, I think, often giving yourself the time and space to actually develop a new sort of belief system.
Hmm.
And uh, and so I, without developing that new belief system, I think it can really, there can be that sort of yeah, like existential, underlying existential uh like unrest, I might say.
Yeah, and depending on people's life experience, they might not know how to navigate that. Like if you were born into high control
Right,
religion, you've been indoctrinated from birth, you don't know how to build a belief system, you don't know how to
right,
go through the process of like what are your actual values.
right.
And I think for a
Yeah.
lot of people, they don't disappear because they're not in a specific religion anymore. I think it just, you have to recalibrate kind of what things are meaningful to you.
Yeah. And I think that like often, and maybe in the deconstruction space too, like I have felt a little bit not unwelcome, but like I don't fit at times, because I think a lot, like there's a lot of, I have experienced or seen a lot of anger in the space, and I don't really feel that.
Yeah.
And when I, like, if I post something angry, it's like a lot of response. But if I post something about like happiness, not so much, right?
Sure.
And so um, I I think that what can happen is that there's this like dialectic between I am either religious or I'm an atheist or agnostic or something of that sort. But I think a lot of folks don't actually know what that means.
Right.
And there, there's just like, there's really like, just, it's just like, oh, I just wish that we could all go to theology school, you know? Um, and, um, and I think that that's like a lot of my clients who come for religious trauma come saying, I like I tried on atheism or agnosticism, whatever it was, and it just doesn't feel like it fits right. But I don't know how to like cope with the idea of being like any sort of religious or spiritual. Um, and so what I think, like, and I'd love to hear what you think about this, because not that one is better or worse or the other, but just like the presence of black and white, maybe the assumption of black and white thinking, of like I am either this extreme or that extreme, instead of being able to investigate for yourself what your value system is, and then understanding where you lie.
Yeah. And I think atheism as a label is a poor one because it's just you're identifying by what you're not,
Mm,
and that's not as meaningful as what you are instead.
mm,
I think professionally, I generally identify as an atheist because I think that matters I worked at a Christian counseling place when I started my career.
mm,
Like, I think to be out and about as a secular therapist is helpful. But like I engage in personal, like I identify as atheo-pagan, which is a non-theistic paganism, like
yeah,
secular naturalism type thing. And like that's really meaningful to me. So like that has
yeah,
value. And I think as I don't mind sharing that part of me, either professionally or with clients, but it's not, I'm not advocating for it. I'm just saying like, right, that's where I've landed and that's what feels comfortable. I love nature, always have. I have ADHD, so there's a lot about like the natural world that's helpful for my mental health and becomes sacred because of that. But yeah, no, that angry atheist trope exists for a reason, I think. Um,
mm,
but I think it's one of those things where that's part of the process for some people. I look at it, I'm a marriage therapist, so I look at it as kind of a breakup. Like
mm,
you don't have to
yeah,
go through the 5 stages of grief to go through a breakup. Like that's wildly oversimplistic. But like
mm,
there's some anger there, there's some bargaining there. I think similarly, there's some anger that comes up with people when they're like, wait, I was lied to, or there were
yeah,
injustices done, I was harmed. So I think that anger speaks to like your values being
yeah,
trampled
it
on.
does.
But yeah, I don't think that's the healthiest place. That sounds like I'm judging. That's not for everyone to stay in that angry space.
I
I don't
think
think it's super healthy.
I think the key, I would say, at least for me or from my perspective, is like the stay. He's like to stay there, and I think like that's the piece. It is super healthy to be to rageful, um, but forever it gets a little tiring. um,
Yeah.
so
Yeah, I tend to
yeah,
say like anger, I tend to say emotions are neutral. It's what actions we're attaching to them. And so
mm,
being intentional in our response, like if you're angry about, Roe v. Wade being overturned, or you're angry, like, and you do something about it, like that's great. If you're,
mm,
just posting online every day and getting angrier and angrier, that's probably not going to be
mm,
super sustainable for you long term. So like,
mm,
again, I think it's emotions are neutral. What actions are we attaching to those things?
yeah. And like I guess what I would say about like what we were talking about a second ago about like religiosity versus atheism is like neither one of those, like they're neutral. Like neither one of them is like really better or worse. From what I'm, especially where I'm coming from as a therapist, is that it's like one, how you relate to it and its impact on you, and like and then like being intentional, using critical thinking skills to decide like, does this align with the way that you see yourself, others, in the world, in the divine, the sacred?
Yeah.
um and it's like from that place. And so if that aligns with a religion or with atheism or with like right paganism or with like whatever other thing, like being woo woo, like then it's about like using the critical thinking skills to actually determine what is like authentically aligned with how you see the world.
Yeah. Yeah. And I see some of the high control religion tactics of in wellness spaces that are secular that,
Yeah,
so
definitely.
right. It's being aware of those things. It's not those things didn't get created by religion and they don't exist just in religion. Like those
No, I
those are
have a lot of
biases.
people who come and talk about how it happens in their workplace. Like their workplace uses those things.
Yep.
So it's definitely not, or like a yoga. Someone messaged me about. I don't remember if it was yoga or like some other workout space, but like these tactics are not isolated to religion.
Right. Yeah. Religion takes advantage of them in the same way that other places take advantage of them. They're naturally occurring biases in our
Yeah,
brain. We like to categorize things. We have in group, out groups. And when that gets crystallized intentionally, that does some different things to our brain.
yeah,
But yeah, I think, I mean, talking about spiritual but not religious, or like the rise of the nuns, I see all these articles,
mm,
NONE,
mm-hmm,
the rise of the
mm-hmm,
nuns. Like, I think
yeah,
it's a thing that people are becoming more aware of as people leave church and don't necessarily pick up a different specified identity. Like, I think that process of meaning making is important still at that time.
Totally. And this actually comes up with almost all of my clients who are not there specifically for religious trauma. Like, I've seen a lot of clients who are in a big life transition and have left whatever career or an employment or something like that. And we talk about how even if they didn't grow up religious, like generally a few decades ago, religion is what provided people with a set of rules that said, this is what makes life meaningful, and this is what makes you a good person or a bad person. And with what you're talking about, the new research coming out with it, like the nuns being the highest growing sort of affiliation, in quotes, of religiosity or spirituality, that there, I think because of what we were saying a few minutes ago about how we often don't then cultivate something new in its place, it is my unresearched opinion that what then happens is our brain is like sort of, okay, well, what is the next like biggest thing that I do in life? Well, it's work. And so then work is what I believe, what we have seen is like work is then like given the emphasis that was put on what used to be or historically put on religion. And I think because people often, especially if they're going through a period of unemployment, it brings up a lot of sentiment around that, like being valuable or being worthy or anything like that. And if you don't have a job that like you're just on fire, passionate for, any of those kind of things that people say, you know, your job should meet at the crossroads of whatever, that you like, I see a lot of people who are like, you know, like there's a lot of conflict around this because their job is like, meh, just like pays the bills, you know? And so I don't know, I think that like, and then I think that that's doubled if your workplace is culty. So it just like, I think that it's just because we often, I think, end up asking the question of what makes life meaningful of work, especially as Americans. We're like, hi, I'm Hannah, I'm a therapist.
Right.
Like, hi, Jeremy, what do you do? Nice to meet you.
Right. Yeah, we're not talking about what our favorite albums are when we first meet someone. We talk about what we do for work.
Right. And that's like my soapbox. But I, and being in other countries where work is like less of a, like less valuable, less important. I have friends who I legitimately, after years of knowing them, I do not know what they do for work. You know.
Yeah. I know my clients listen to my podcast, so I don't want to go too into detail how I'm a terrible therapist, but I will forget what people do for work constantly, because for me, like as a therapist, it's not particularly important, like unless it's relevant to what I'm working on. Like if I'm doing couples therapy and somebody has a weird work schedule, like, I'll remember it then because it affects the couple. But like I have like vague ideas of like sales or engineer type thing. Like
yeah.
Job titles are because it doesn't matter a whole lot.
Yeah.
But I think, you know, I'm going to nerd out a little bit on systems theory for as a marriage therapist, but like we talk about first order change, which is like a behavior change. I want to quit smoking, or I want to lose weight, or whatever. Behavior change, just changing behaviors to get a result. And second order change being like a system change. So like we as a couple are going to change the way we parent, or making a change at work and the culture or whatever. And then third order change is really that belief system. And so I think like I was a marriage therapist. I've been a marriage therapist my whole career. So for me, that third order change is where like lasting change happens. And that's really powerful, transformative stuff. And so I love doing this work with people who are deconstructing, because I see that as third order change, where like this belief system is changing. And it's not a dichotomy. Like, it's not, I was religious, now I'm not. It's a changing. It's a process of like, well, what does that mean moving forward?
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's so meaningful. I was trying to think of a different word to avoid meaning making being meaningful, but like, it's so powerful to see in people's lives when they land someplace that's genuine and someplace that's authentic. Like,
Totally.
it's so cool.
Yeah, totally. I know as a therapist, like I've had a few longtime clients end recently, and it's so emotional to as the clinician. I think they know this too. As the clinician, when sometimes like this is not probably always kosher to say, but like I talk to my clients often more than I talk to my friends, and so even though it's different than a friend relationship, there is that like just so much relationship there. Like there's so much history of knowing someone, and so when they're like flourishing, it's like so touching to send them off and on this like I don't know on this like new phase of life and their journey, and also so lovely when that actually gets to happen in therapy, because you don't get to practice endings very often or very well. And so I always tell them, like, we get to practice this here, even though it's hard for both of us.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's a cool process. It's weird. It's hard. It's hard to talk about it for non-therapists. And I'm not saying it just happens in therapy, but like, I always talk about like how honored I am to be a therapist. And I think it sounds so like janky to people who aren't therapists. Like, oh, everyone just says that. But like,
Yeah.
it's hard to explain. Like, right, I don't know. Go on that journey with someone is a very like, I don't know, I feel very honored to be able to do that with people.
Totally. I feel that.
Let's segue a little bit. Can we talk about kind of the now I'm having a total blank. The package that you're offering, the coaching that you offer, you've got this whole program you've put together for people. Can we talk about that a little bit?
Oh, sure. So I offer, so I have my private practice, which is where I work one-on-one with people. And currently that is only for people in the state of Massachusetts, but soon, hopefully within the next few weeks, it will also be for people in Florida and Texas.
Nice.
Yeah. And outside of that though, that's for one-on-one work. Outside of that, I have created a course called Making Peace with Your Religious Past. And that is really where I have taken all of the sort of steps and resources that I've used with my clients one-on-one and compiled it into this course that, someone could walk through on their own. Although there is some like Facebook online support, but it's where like all of those resources are compiled together, and I think like really like just what I and maybe you did not have when we were deconstructing of the like what it does take to actually change a belief system. How like what are the practices for working through like the rage or guilt or shame or the panic that comes up when you were doing that. And so some of the body-based practices, and then reimagining relationships and sexuality, and even spirituality like after you do those two things. Because I would say like those are really, I think, the areas that I see most folks kind of come out of high control religion with conflict in, and were the areas for myself where I had experienced that religious harm.
Yeah. And I love that. As a therapist, knowing not everyone can afford therapy, like I love how many people are putting together these things so that people can kind of go through it on their own time. Like, I think therapy benefits everyone. I'm biased. I'm a therapist. But I think
Yes.
therapy isn't designed inherently to be like lifelong for people. It's something you're in and
Right.
out of as needed. You get a
Right.
professional's help for a specific thing or a specific couple of things. And so then like getting resources like this or having somebody who has the knowledge,
Yeah.
not just the school academic knowledge, but also the lived experience, putting this stuff together is awesome. And I think like for people to have these communities that are popping up is really powerful. It
Yeah.
can be very lonely deconstructing when
Yeah.
everyone you know is a church person and you're leaving
Right.
that. And so
Oh my
like
gosh.
that's a whole
Yes.
process too.
Totally. And like the idea behind, I kind of went back and forth on the Facebook thing because I hate Facebook and I am
Sure.
like never on it. It exists for me, but it doesn't. And, but I ended up deciding to put together and offer this private Facebook community for anyone who is going through it because it can be such a lonely process and it can be really helpful, like not just from me, but from other people who are going through the same process to get feedback on like maybe you're working through a specific belief and you're just stuck. And like, kind of putting that to the group or the community and saying like, is anybody seeing something that I'm not seeing? Or,
Hmm.
like this kind of thing. So I think that it can be really powerful to have this community around you who is, um, like working through the same steps and process.
Yeah. Yeah. It's almost like a cohort of like people who
Yes,
are going through the same
great
thing at the
word.
same time, finding each other.
Yeah, great word for that.
Yeah.
Um,
Uh, Go ahead.
oh, sorry. I guess, like I was thinking, I didn't totally explain the whole thing. The last couple of parts is that I have a few bonuses that are a part of the course that are near and dear to my heart, which are Intro to World Religions, um, a deep dive into the mystical and contemplative traditions, and then how to make friends as an adult after a high control religion. And these three felt just so important and like these just for me really felt like they kind of tied the whole thing together because like I was describing my experience in my grad program, I was surrounded by diversity and it sort of was almost like exposure therapy for learning that other religions or religious expressions aren't scary. And so that is sort of this idea around like learning that there are other religious expressions and that they are not or they don't have to be scary. And then even if you choose to be religious, there is so much outside of orthodoxy that sounds probably a lot more like, spirituality or spiritual but not religious than what
Mhm.
you've ever heard about in church, for example. And then the friend thing, because when you've been taught that there are some people who are in and there are some people who are out, it can be hard to just like forget that when you leave.
Yeah.
Um, so that is, and those have been, I think, like some of the biggest aspects of like rebuilding that I've
Yeah.
done.
Yeah. I tell people I'm very upfront with it. Like the hardest thing I work with in therapy is adults making new friends. And
Oh,
like
yes.
just in general, and then throw in like the deconstruction or reconstruction aspect of leaving a high control religion and all that goes along with that. Like it's very complicated. We
Yeah.
make friends with people based on proximity. Who's in your neighborhood? Who do you go to school with? Who are your work people? And like we don't get a ton of training anywhere
No,
formally on how to make those connections and how to grow and nurture those connections because you don't just find a best friend overnight.
no. And like also this is something that I've learned and still probably lifelong learning here that like my expectations for relationships are extremely high. Um and that like is that because of high control religion? Maybe. Um but that like there isn't there is likely in my adult life there's not going to be one friend or one person who satisfies all of my friend needs.
Right.
Um, just like my partner doesn't, like satisfy, if you will, all of my needs as a human being. And so in like that modern conception, it was that the French philosopher Alain de Botton, I think, who talks about modern love and how it is this new conception of love or understanding of it, to expect someone to be our everything.
Sure. Yeah.
So I see that come into play for like myself and other adult like clients as well, who have this expectation of like, I haven't found my best friend yet.
Right. Yeah. It's a soulmate quality. I tell my clients all the time, like, I'm not a romantic marriage therapist, which is a fun thing. But that like, like this soulmate idea is sold by Hallmark. It's sold by Disney. Like, it's not a real thing. It's not based on anything. Like, I love my wife when she gets together with best friend, they go thrift shopping. I don't like thrift stores. Like, sensory issues. There's a lot of things about going into Goodwill that I don't love. And like, so yeah, like for her to be with her best friend who likes to go thrifting with her, or her sisters or whoever, like, it's not weird or threatening to be like, oh, my partner gets their needs met by another person. Like, that doesn't have to be a bad thing. That makes a lot of sense in most contexts. It's just we have this weird idea around soulmates or my other half or you complete me type like ideology.
Yeah. And I think like, so I've moved a lot. I think that, like, for example, one of the biggest culture shocks that I've ever experienced as somebody who has like traveled the world numerous times is from Texas to Boston. And that one was tough. And I think like it is a skill that we learn and cultivate. And so even as I say that, like, I do think that there are a lot of like behavioral things that someone can choose to participate in or incorporate. And at the same time, it's like I also have to kind of hold that with like an open hand, like not in a fist, that I can go to all the knitting meetups and that I can find, and I can join the gym, and I can go to co-working spaces and whatever, and I can still, like, it can still not come easily. And that there's just like normalizing, also normalizing. I have this friend who is amazing, and this new friend, and like we sort of normalize for each other, and there are other groups of friends who sort of make us feel excluded. And I think that, like, I just say that to say, like, it has been so refreshing to me to have somebody else say, oh God, it's not just you. Like, this happens to me all the time. Like, listen to what these gym girls did. And because, like, I think that when people, and I hear this from my clients too, like when there's a group of friends who get together and then they don't invite you, it can feel like so embarrassing. Like, oh my gosh, like, why didn't they invite me? And just like painful, right? And to have somebody in your life who like you guys can sort of normalize that for each other. And then, like, one so angry, I sent a voice message, and then there was this friend responding, was like, it's kind of funny if you think about it. And it was like, from then on, I was like, oh, I guess you're right. Like, it's kind of like, there's just, like that heaviness and that seriousness that we bring to life with high control religion. Like, things are so serious. And it's like, sometimes it's like, yeah, not that serious. Like, this person can be a friend for pizza, and that's it.
Right. And being like, thinking of it in terms of like building support. I talk about a dartboard, like the different rings on a dartboard, like your inner circle people.
Mm,
And then as you get out and you have those people who every 2 months your work friends go out and you're included, but you're not included in their weekly hangouts. Like that's fine. Like then they're
yeah,
every 2 month friends and it's cool.
yeah, yeah. Oh, it's a nice analogy. I have used before, like there are friends for pizza, or you have like soul friends or heart friends,
Hmm.
um, or like Jesus himself, Jesus the man, did had like the one whom Jesus loved, and then had the three, and then had the 12, and then the apostles, and then like just everybody else. And so I'm
Right.
like, okay, even Jesus like didn't have like I like had a whole social network.
Hmm. Yeah.
Um, so even for my non-religious folks, like they're kind of like, oh, I guess that's true.
Yeah. Right. Um, Hannah, I'm going to segue a hard left turn here. Um,
Yeah.
what do you do to kind of maintain your mental well-being? What do you do maybe daily or weekly? Like how are the things that kind of help keep you balanced and feeling like you're taking care of yourself?
Sure. So lately, that is putting really strict boundaries around social media and technology. For example, I don't allow myself to be on social media on the weekends. And then outside of that, I do a lot of knitting. And I do some other kind of like crafty things like creative journaling or calligraphy. And then I'm just kind of, I think, I don't know if I've always been this way, but I'm just kind of a beginner at a lot of things. Like I'm beginning to learn calligraphy and like art and skiing and swimming and dancing. And so I'm just kind of a beginner at a lot of things. But I do a lot of like movement and exercise, and then travel is probably one of the things um, that like kind of keeps me sane. We're going on vacation soon, and just is sort of where I feel like most me or like most alive.
Sure. Yeah. Very cool. You don't know how to swim?
I mean, I do.
That's the one out of all of that. That's the one that I'm going to pick out.
um, I do know how to swim. I can hold my own. I can jump off into the sea or whatever. Like, but I'm afraid of sharks. Thank you, Texas and Massachusetts. There are active shark attacks there. Um,
Sure.
and so I'm terrified of sharks. So even when I'm in the Mediterranean, I can jump off, come up having like an actual panic attack. And because you can see to the bottom, and they're like rocks, and they just look like dark
Sure.
shapes and panic. So anyways, when I'm talking about learning how to swim, I mean like maybe learning how to swim without a panic attack.
Nice. I
Yeah.
wasn't picking on you. I was normalizing. I didn't learn how to swim till I was 16. I taught
Oh
myself
yeah.
like just one
Oh
summer up by
nice.
my grandparents because like I just was like, I don't know, doing the doggy paddle. Like again, I
Yeah.
wasn't drowning, but I didn't know
Yeah.
how to swim
Yeah.
effectively.
I don't think I could say mine is effective. I have asthma, and so
Sure.
the being under, like, I can run, I do a lot of cycling, but like being underwater makes me like freak out a little bit. Like there is no oxygen down here.
Sure.
And so this is a little bit, it's kind of a mental game, swimming for me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So no, that's good. It's good to pick up skills and learn things and try and approach it in a different way. It's good to not drown.
Yeah, totally. And I don't know, I read this or listened to this audiobook from the library app a few years ago during COVID about being a beginner. And this guy who just was raising his daughter and decided to quit a bunch of stuff and like become like do stuff and then quit and like be a beginner. And I do think that it is a good skill for me to cultivate because I'm not very patient in general. I'm not a super patient person, and so like learning a language and things like that is like really kind of stretches my patient muscle.
Yeah. No, I like that. I'm gonna steal this because I have ADHD, so I do things for 3 to 6 months and then never do them again. I'm just gonna start
Yeah,
owning it, and like, and then I quit it on
yeah,
purpose, not on accident.
yeah, exactly.
Hannah, this has been awesome. If I highly recommend people follow you on Instagram, which is where I connected with you. You put out a lot of great content. But if people want to work with you or they want to learn more about some of the things that you offer, where can they go to find out more about you and your work?
Sure. So my website is Safe Talk Therapy. That is the name of my private practice. So if you're in Massachusetts and soon to be Florida or Texas and you're interested in therapy, then that would be a great way to reach out. And then if you're just interested in staying connected, you can always join the like email newsletter that I send out, and that will kind of keep you up to date on all of the like new happenings.
Yeah, very cool. And we will have all those links in the show notes for people to check out. And all my stuff is at Wellness with Jer, so people can find my stuff there. Hannah, this has been wonderful. Thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy.
And to all our wonderful listeners, thanks for tuning in again this week. We'll be back next week with a new episode. Take care, everyone.